The morning sun cast long shadows across my suburban backyard as I stood there with my shovel, completely unaware that I was about to uncover a secret that would turn my quiet neighborhood into a battlefield. It was a crisp Saturday in early October, the kind of day that makes you want to tackle those home improvement projects you've been putting off for months. My name is Marcus Thompson, and I had just moved into 47 Maple Grove Drive 6 months earlier, a modest two-story colonial in what I thought was a peaceful community governed by a reasonable homeowners association. How wrong I was. The project seemed simple enough. Install a French drain system along the back of my property to address the persistent water pooling that occurred every time it rained. The previous owners had apparently ignored this issue for years, and I was tired of watching my lawn turn into a swamp every spring and fall. I had done my research, obtained all the necessary permits from the city, and even had the utilities marked. Those colorful spray-painted lines that crisscross suburban yards like abstract art, warning homeowners where not to dig. What I hadn't expected was to find myself face-to-face with Margaret Whitmore, the HOA president, barely 3 hours into my project. Margaret was the kind of woman who seemed to have been born wearing a power suit and a scowl. At 62, she had ruled the Maple Grove Community Association with an iron fist for the past 8 years, treating every minor infraction like a federal crime and every homeowner like a potential anarchist plotting to destroy property values. Her silver hair was always pulled back in a tight bun that seemed to stretch her face into a permanent expression of disapproval, and she had a way of speaking that made even "good morning" sound like an accusation. I had been digging for about 2 hours, making steady progress along the property line, when I heard the sharp clicking of heels on pavement. I looked up to see Margaret marching across my lawn with the determination of a general approaching a battle, a thick folder clutched in her manicured hands and her lips pressed into a thin line that spelled trouble. "Excuse me, Mr. Thompson," she called out, her voice carrying that particular tone that made my stomach drop. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" I leaned on my shovel, wiping sweat from my forehead with the back of my gardening glove. "Morning, Margaret. Just installing a drainage system. Got all my permits right here if you'd like to see them." I gestured toward the small stack of papers I'd left on my patio table, weighted down with a rock to prevent them from blowing away. Her eyes narrowed as she surveyed the trench I'd been digging. It was already about 3 feet deep and ran roughly 20 feet along what I believed to be my property line, based on the survey I'd had done when I purchased the house. The soil was surprisingly easy to dig, a mixture of clay and sandy, loam that yielded readily to my shovel. "Permits from the city are one thing," Margaret said, her voice dripping with the authority she wielded like a weapon. "But you need HOA approval for any excavation work that might affect common areas or neighboring properties. This appears to be dangerously close to the property boundary, and I have serious concerns about what you might be disturbing." I felt my jaw tighten. This was exactly the kind of bureaucratic nonsense I'd hoped to avoid by doing my homework ahead of time. "Margaret, I had a professional survey done. This trench is entirely on my property, well within the setback requirements. I even left a 5-foot buffer from the actual property line to be extra cautious." She opened her folder with a flourish that would have made a courtroom lawyer proud and pulled out a laminated document. "According to the HOA covenants, section 4.7.3, any excavation deeper than 18 inches requires prior written approval from the Architectural Review Committee. You're clearly in violation." The sun was getting hotter, and my patience was wearing thin. I had planned to spend the weekend working on this project, and the last thing I wanted was to get bogged down in HOA politics. "Look, Margaret, I appreciate your concern, but I've checked with the city. I have all the proper permits, and I'm working entirely on my own property. The HOA covenants can't override municipal permits or property rights." Her face flushed red, a color that clashed dramatically with her powder blue blazer. "We'll see about that, Mr. Thompson. I'm ordering you to stop this work immediately pending a full review by the board." "You can't order me to do anything on my own property," I replied, my voice remaining steady despite my growing frustration. "I've followed all the rules, Margaret. This drainage system is necessary to prevent water damage to my foundation." That's when Margaret made her fatal mistake. In her anger and desire to assert dominance, she stepped closer to the trench, gesturing wildly with her folder. "This is completely unacceptable. You can't just dig up the neighborhood without considering the impact on infrastructure. There could be utilities down there, shared systems that serve multiple properties." As if summoned by her words, my shovel struck something hard about 4 feet down in the trench. The metallic clang echoed across the yard, and we both froze. I knelt down and carefully brushed away the loose soil, revealing what appeared to be a PVC pipe running perpendicular to my trench. A pipe that definitely wasn't on any of the utility maps I'd been provided. Margaret's face went from red to white in the span of about 3 seconds. "What is that?" I asked, though I was beginning to suspect I already knew. The pipe was clearly a water line, newer PVC, probably installed within the last 10 years, running from the direction of Margaret's house toward the community's common area. But according to every survey, utility map, and official document I possessed, there shouldn't be any water lines in this location. Margaret's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. That's probably just... It could be an old irrigation line that was abandoned." But even as she spoke, I could hear the sound of running water. The pipe wasn't abandoned. It was very much in active use. I carefully excavated around it, revealing more of the line and confirming what I was beginning to suspect. This unauthorized water line was running directly through my property. "Margaret," I said slowly, my voice taking on a dangerous calm, "this appears to be an active water line running through my yard without any easement or permission. Do you know anything about this?" The silence stretched between us like a taut wire ready to snap. Margaret's carefully maintained composure was cracking, and I could see the panic beginning to creep into her eyes. She clutched her folder tighter, as if those laminated HOA regulations could somehow protect her from what we both knew was a much bigger problem than my drainage project. "I need to make some phone calls," she said abruptly, backing away from the trench. "Don't touch anything else until I get back." But I was already reaching for my phone. If there was an unauthorized utility line running through my property, I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with. This wasn't just about my drainage system anymore. This was about property rights, water theft, and what appeared to be a very illegal installation that someone had hoped would never be discovered. As Margaret hurried back toward her house, her heels clicking frantically on the pavement, I couldn't help but notice how her confident stride had transformed into something that looked suspiciously like retreat. The morning that had started with such promise was turning into something much more complex, and I had the distinct feeling that my simple home improvement project was about to become the catalyst for exposing secrets that had been buried, quite literally, for years. The water continued to flow through the pipe beneath my feet, and with each passing minute, I was becoming more certain that I had stumbled onto something that Margaret Whitmore had very much hoped would remain hidden. The question now was not whether I would continue digging, but what else I might uncover in the process. Little did I know that this discovery would not only change my relationship with the HOA forever, but would also reveal a web of deception that ran far deeper than any drainage system I could ever install. 3 hours later, my backyard had transformed into what looked like a crime scene investigation. After Margaret's hasty retreat, I had made a series of phone calls that brought an unexpected parade of officials to my previously quiet suburban sanctuary. The city's water department had sent 2 inspectors, the county surveyor arrived with his sophisticated equipment, and most surprisingly, a soft-spoken woman named Elena Rodriguez from the state's utility fraud division had shown up, with a briefcase full of legal documents and a very serious expression. But it was the 4th visitor who truly changed everything. A frail, elderly man who appeared at my gate just as Elena was photographing the exposed water line. He walked with a wooden cane, his shoulders stooped with age, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of years and what sounded suspiciously like guilt. "Excuse me," he said quietly, approaching our small group gathered around the trench. "I'm Harold Whitmore. Margaret is my daughter." The silence that followed was deafening. Elena looked up from her camera, the city inspectors paused their measurements, and I felt my stomach drop as I realized we were about to learn something that would complicate this situation far beyond a simple case of utility fraud. Harold's weathered hands shook as he gripped his cane. I need to tell you the truth about that water line. It's my fault it's there." Margaret chose that exact moment to reappear, accompanied by a man in an expensive suit who I assumed was her lawyer. When she saw her father standing by the trench, her face went through a spectrum of emotions: surprise, horror, anger, and finally, something that looked like resignation. "Dad, what are you doing here?" she demanded, her voice high and strained. "I told you to stay inside until this was resolved." But Harold wasn't looking at his daughter. His roomy blue eyes were fixed on me with an intensity that was both apologetic and determined. "Young man, I need to apologize to you. That water line shouldn't be there, and the reason it is, well, it's because I was dying." The lawyer immediately stepped forward. "Mr. Whitmore, I strongly advise you not to say anything further without—" "Oh, hush up, Gerald," Harold snapped with surprising vigor. "I'm 87 years old. I've got maybe 6 months left according to my doctors, and I'm not going to meet my maker with this on my conscience." Elena Rodriguez had stopped photographing and was now openly staring. As the state fraud investigator, she had probably seen her share of utility theft cases, but I could tell this wasn't unfolding like anything she'd encountered before. Harold continued, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. "5 years ago, I was diagnosed with kidney failure. Needed dialysis 3 times a week, but the treatment made me so weak I could barely take care of myself. Margaret was working full-time, trying to manage the HOA and dealing with her own family problems." He glanced at his daughter, and for a moment, his expression softened. Her husband had just left her, and she was struggling to make ends meet while taking care of me. Margaret's lawyer was frantically whispering in her ear, but she seemed frozen, watching her father with a mixture of love and terror. "The dialysis treatments require a lot of clean water," Harold continued. "More than our regular household supply could handle efficiently. The doctor recommended we install a special filtration system, but it needed a dedicated water line with higher pressure than what we had coming into the house." I was beginning to understand where this was going, but the full picture was still emerging. Margaret researched the costs of having the city run a new line to our house legally. The estimate was over $15,000, plus months of permits and construction that would tear up half the neighborhood. We didn't have that kind of money, and honestly, I didn't think I had that kind of time. Elena finally spoke up. "So, you decided to tap into an existing line illegally?" Harold nodded slowly. "Margaret hired a contractor, someone who promised he could solve the problem quietly and cheaply. The plan was to connect to the main line that runs along the community common area, but when he started digging, he discovered that line was too deep and would require extensive excavation that couldn't be hidden. My property. They had chosen my property because it offered the easiest path to a usable water source. The contractor suggested running the line through your backyard instead," Harold said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He said the previous owners never used that part of their yard, and the connection could be made to the irrigation system that serves the common areas. Margaret paid him $8,000, money she borrowed against her retirement account, to install it secretly." Margaret finally found her voice. "Dad, please stop." But Harold wasn't finished. "The worst part is, 6 months after we installed it, I started responding well to a new medication. My kidney function improved enough that I didn't need the dialysis anymore. Haven't needed it for over 3 years now." The implications hit me like a physical blow. "So you've been stealing water from the community system for 3 years for regular household use?" Margaret's composure finally cracked completely. Tears began streaming down her face as she sank onto my patio chair, her folder of HOA regulations scattered at her feet. "I tried to figure out how to remove it," she said through her sobs, "but the contractor disappeared with our money, and I couldn't afford to hire someone else to fix what we'd done wrong. And then time kept passing, and it got harder and harder to admit what we'd done." Elena was taking notes rapidly. "Mrs. Whitmore, are you aware that utility theft at this level constitutes a felony in this state?" The lawyer jumped in immediately. "My client will not be answering any more questions without—" "Gerald, shut up," Margaret said wearily. "Just shut up." She looked at me with eyes red from crying. "Marcus, I know you have every right to hate me. I've been terrorizing you about your legitimate drainage project while knowing I was the one breaking the law. I've been taking water that belongs to the community, driving up everyone's utility costs and living with this secret eating away at me for years." Harold reached into his jacket and pulled out a worn envelope. "I've been carrying this around for months," he said, handing it to Elena. "It's a full confession, with all the details about the installation, the contractor we hired, and the money we paid. I was going to mail it to the authorities after I was gone. I didn't want Margaret to face this alone, but I also couldn't bear the thought of dying without making this right." As Elena read through the confession, I found myself in an impossible position. These weren't mustache-twirling villains who had set out to steal from their neighbors. They were a desperate father and daughter who had made a terrible decision, under crushing circumstances, and then found themselves trapped by the consequences. "There's more," Harold said quietly. "Margaret, tell him about the other problem." Margaret looked up at her father with panic in her eyes. "Dad, no, that's not—" "Tell him," Harold insisted. "If we're doing this, we're doing it completely." Margaret took a shuddering breath. "The illegal water line isn't just connected to our house. When the contractor installed it, he also ran a branch line to the community center." Elena's pen stopped moving. "Explain that." "The community center's water bills were getting expensive," Margaret said, her voice barely audible. "The contractor suggested that if we were already running an illegal line, we could offset some of the HOA's operating costs by connecting the community center to the stolen water as well. He said it would save the association hundreds of dollars a month. The scope of this fraud was expanding beyond anything I had imagined. So, you've been stealing water for your personal use and for the HOA facilities?" I thought I was helping. "The community," Margaret whispered. "I thought I was being a good president by finding ways to keep our fees low. But instead, I was stealing from the city and putting everyone at risk of legal liability." Harold reached over and took his daughter's hand. "The cancer diagnosis changes everything, Margaret. We can't keep running from this." I stared at him. "Cancer diagnosis?" Margaret nodded through her tears. "Dad was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 8 weeks ago. Stage 4. The doctors say he has maybe 4 to 6 months if he's lucky." The emotional complexity of the situation was overwhelming. Here was a man facing his own mortality, desperate to clear his conscience before dying, while his daughter, who had been portrayed as a neighborhood tyrant, was revealed to be someone who had made increasingly desperate decisions while trying to care for her dying father and serve her community. Elena closed her notebook and looked at all of us. "This is significantly more complex than a typical utility theft case. The amount of water stolen over 5 years, the community center, connection, and the premeditated nature of the installation make this a serious matter. However, the circumstances and your voluntary disclosure will certainly be factors in how this proceeds." The lawyer, Gerald, finally spoke up again. "What are we looking at in terms of potential consequences?" "Restitution to the water authority, significant fines, and potentially criminal charges," Elena replied. "However, given Mr. Harold Whitmore's health situation and the family's cooperation, there may be options for plea agreements or alternative sentencing." As the afternoon sun began to cast longer shadows across my torn-up backyard, I realized